Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, and our program this time, the first of two parts, is called Mistakes, Half-Truths, and Lies, Why Records Are Wrong. And one of the things that I've discovered in over 40 years of research is that there's more to it than just distinguishing between a primary source and a secondary source. As historians and researchers, we are taught that primary sources made contemporary with a certain event are more accurate than secondary sources. But that is not always true, because records can be wrong because they all start with a person. And it truly depends on the person's reliability in completing that record. So we have to consider in this story of records with who made them, when did they make them, why were they produced, and where. And you'll see these questions become kind of intuitive as we start with our story. And in the first part of our program, we're going to be looking at three categories of mistakes, half-truths, and lies. We're going to begin with errors in records, omissions in records, and then inaccuracies. And then as we near the end of this program, you'll hear what's coming in part two. So let's look at the first series of slides here on a trail of errors. In Massachusetts, a very reliable source of information is a series of published vital records that were published by the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston almost 50 years ago. So on a library shelf, you would encounter vital records of Brockton, Massachusetts to the year 1850. And in the entry under births, you would see this record for a family named Thresher, also known as Thrasher. These were collateral relatives of mine. And we have under births Mary C. Thrasher, 1828, and Reuben, her husband, born in 1802. And on the basis of this entry, the International Genealogical Index at one point created an entry for Reuben Thrasher, born in Brockton, Massachusetts in 1802. He never lived there in his entire life. So how did his birth get recorded in this book? And if you go back to this for a minute, you'll notice that after each of these entries, it says GR8. And this is through a cemetery record. So here we have a nice, substantial cemetery stone for Reuben Thresher, his wife, and their children. And it has his date of birth is 1802. This monument was placed in his memory long after his wife died. And come to find out, Reuben himself wasn't even buried in Brockton, Massachusetts. He died in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and he was buried in a cemetery that burned. So what we have here is a memorial stone honoring his name and his memory, but he is not buried where you can see this stone. And as we look at more contemporary evidence of Reuben Thresher, in the 1850 census, we have his nephew, George, wife Phoebe, other people in the household, and then we have Reuben, who in 1850 was 40 years old. And he is living with his sister, who was considerably older than he. But this record probably is not correct. And here is why. When Reuben died in 1872. It says here that he was born in Maine. So where was he born, and how can we find this out? And the Massachusetts records seem to support the fact that since I know that Reuben's father was named George, in the first entry that we see here, George Thrasher was a head of household in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1800. And then in the second instance, we see George Thrasher, the same person again, who was the head of a household in 1810. So it would seem with Reuben's father, born in Massachusetts, his father living in Massachusetts between 1800 and 1810, that's where Reuben was born. However, I know from records of deeds that for reasons that I do not know, Reuben's father's family picked up and left Plymouth in 1801, moved to Paris, Maine, and that is actually where Reuben was born. And you can see here the arrow is pointing to the birth of Reuben, son of George and Rachel Thrasher, in 1802. So although the father was the head of a household in Massachusetts in 1800 and again in 1810, it doesn't account for this family's sojourn in Paris, Maine, where they lived for 5 or 6 years and then moved back to Plymouth, Massachusetts. Here is an example of compounded mistakes. And this is one of the things that happens online today with various people who upload information to family trees. So here is someone that I have been recently researching. Her name was Fanny Starbird. She was born in Maine on the 30th of June, 1796. It gives her father's name, her mother's name. And you'll note here that this says that this information is based on 12 sources. All of these trees are wrong. All 273 trees are wrong, because there was no Fanny Starbird that was born in 1796. The so-called proof comes from a record of her in the 1860 census when she was married to a man named Jonas Phelps, but no one knows where the Starbird name came from. So beware of family trees, that there is no such thing as safety in numbers. If it's wrong in the first instance and gets copied 273 times, it only compounds the errors. A very common type of wrong conclusion can stem from omissions in records. And death records are notorious for inaccurate information. So take, for example, here is a death record of a woman, again connected to my family, named Lovisa Dunning Carpenter. Here she is a young woman in this photograph taken in the early 1880s. She lived until 1941. She was actually the owner of a hotel in Nantucket. But when she died in 1941, and this is well in the era of modern record keeping, it gives her place of birth, which happens to be correct, as North Harpswell, Maine. But for her father's name, it says Dunning. Birthplace of her father cannot be learned. Name of mother cannot be learned. And the deeper story is here that the person who completed the information on her death certificate simply did not know who her parents were. And that is what is reflected in this record. In another instance here, we have the death record of a woman who was named Vesta Dunifer, who died in Wynne, Maine in 1903. And although it was her husband who gave the information on the death certificate, which at least gives a more or less accurate age of 67 years and 5 months, there's no information given about Vesta's parents, simply that there was an assumption that she was born in the United States. A record of a death for Jeremiah Downs in Rehoboth, Massachusetts. And this was a long-standing mystery for me because this Jeremiah Downs married a relative of mine in New York City in 1850. I know she died young, and on his death certificate here, it has that he was married. So I had to track down a second wife and a third wife. It was correctly reported here that he was born on Long Island, but the names of the parents were not known. And here is an omission that has driven me crazy for almost 40 years. This comes from the original records of Plymouth, Massachusetts, of a marriage announcement of a intention of a marriage between Jonathan Holmes of Plymouth, no woman's name mentioned. I know from other records that her name was Rachel, so what does this mean? Did he marry someone else? Who is this person's name? Maybe I'll be able to figure this out one day, but this is on my bucket list of mysteries to solve. Let's talk now about inaccuracies. So here we have a record of a family living in Township 7 of Washington County, Maine. This is way up north in Maine. And the man's name, who is the head of the household, is Jonas Phelps, a farmer, 48 years old, his wife, Ellen. And then we have a list of children: Martha, Sarah, Albert, Mary, Susan, and then a not named 1-year-old male. Now, not named, perhaps this is the census taker did not learn the name of the baby. In this instance, though, the sex of the baby is wrong because the family moved to an adjacent township within the next 10 years. So in the 1880 census, we have Jonas Phelps, wife Ellen, children, and the unnamed male in the 1870 census is actually their daughter Letty, who is 11 years old. So if we based all subsequent searching on an unnamed male 1 year old in the Phelps household in 1870, we would certainly be going down the wrong path. Here is an example of incorrectly stated information that just resulted in years of blind alleys. We have here the death certificate of Fred Valley, whose real name was Alfred. He died at the Fanny Allen Hospital in Colchester, Vermont on December 9th, 1954. Now, according to this death record, submitted by his daughter with whom he lived, he was born in Richmond, Quebec on the 21st of May, 1882. So I wrote over 50 letters to all sorts of churches in and around Richmond, Quebec. No baptism of an Alfred Valley in 1882. Compounding this is the death certificate of his father. And his father, who was named George Valley, lived to be 89 years old, and it said that his birth was in Richmond, Quebec. So we have a son supposedly born in 1882 in Richmond, Quebec, and the father born in Richmond, Quebec in 1882. Neither would prove to be correct. And adding to the inaccuracy of all of this, we have the parents' names given as Joseph Valley and Mary Boisvert. Boisvert, one of those names that became translated in American records as Greenwood. I searched and I searched, but I could find no record of a marriage of a couple named Joseph Valley and Marie Boisvert. So eventually, I was able to track down the correct information by locating the naturalization record of Alfred Valley when he took out his primary declaration in South Burlington, Vermont. And on his naturalization record, it stated that he was born in Dixville, Quebec. Where is Dixville? If you can locate Island Pond on the map and go about 20 miles due north, that is where Dixville is. Now, 30 years ago, before the availability of looking through Canadian censuses online, I had to order at the Rutland Library from the National Archives of Canada the microfilm for Dixville, Canada in the year 1881. At the time, the Rutland Library only had 2 microfilm machines, and if there was a wait, you had only 15 minutes to find something. And this was by trawling through a microfilm frame by frame at a time. It took me 3 trips, 15 minutes each one, on several consecutive days to locate the correct family in Barford, which is right next to Dixville, Quebec, in 1881. And I found the father, George Valley, his wife, who was Selina Marquis. And the interesting thing here is the couple 2 houses away was Joseph Valley, but the mother's name was not Marie Boisvert, it was Josette Allard. And this led me to find a couple that was married of an appropriate age to be the missing link. And all the people that were said to have been born in Richmond, Quebec, were actually born in the town of Baie de Fèvre. Now, if that had been stated correctly on the record in the first instance, it would have saved me months and months of research going in the wrong direction. Here's another funny thing about records sometimes. In the marriage license of George Valley, my father-in-law, whom I knew well, married in 1938, we could never find a copy of his marriage at the state of Vermont. And I thought, did the priest who married them simply forget to include it? Well, after his death, in going through family papers, I realized that sometimes his name, which had been anglicized to V-A-L-L-E-Y, was sometimes spelled in French V-A-L-L-E accent aigu E. But there was no accent aigu on an American typewriter in the 30s. So someone had mistaken the accent mark for an I. So eventually I found the marriage record by looking at V-A-L-L-I-E. And these kinds of mistakes will continue to proliferate today because increasing numbers of people cannot read penmanship. in one loopy vowel is often mistaken with another. Here is a certificate of marriage of someone connected to my family, of a Patrick Fitzgerald and a Honora Doyle. And this came right from the parish church in County Kerry, Ireland, where I had written in 2009. They had a daughter named Nellie, and Nellie moved to Attleboro, Massachusetts. And when she married a man named Charles Donnelly, her marriage certificate at the town said her father's name was Patrick, so that dovetails, but the mother's name was given as Frances Smith. Now, I knew this was not right. Someone had just made a mistake somewhere along the way. Maybe they copied from the wrong entry. So, thinking I was very clever, I wrote to the church where they were married. And as it turns out, the parish secretary was a college classmate of mine. And on the church marriage certificate, it once again says that the mother's name is Frances Smith. So here I am confronted with two sources of information that said Nellie's mother's name was Frances Smith. And it was one of those things I could not let it go. While I was not sure of the source of the error, eventually I was proved correct, because when I tracked down Nellie, whose real name was Ellen, to her death in 1950, at last I was vindicated, because her father's name, Patrick Dwyer, and her mother, Hannah Honora Doyle's name was on the death certificate. So had I been looking for a Frances Smith Dwyer, I never would have found her, because she did not exist. And sometimes people, when they don't know the names of someone's parents, they simply supply names of people that did not exist. Another example, this time from Maine. We have the death record of Joseph Posey, all sorts of spelling variations here. It alleges that his parents were Joseph Posey and his mother's name was Lucy Chamberlain, or in English, Chamberlain. No such couple existed. And when I found the marriage record of this man in Notre Dame in Montreal, it says here on his marriage record that he was an enfant naturel, which means he was an out-of-wedlock child. So if on his marriage record he is an out-of-wedlock child, how could I ever figure out who his parents were? And the clue came by looking family by family in the 1850 census, where you can see that this man, Joseph, is in the household with his grandfather, and rather than his name being called Posey, it's called Joseph Naturel, which means that he was an out-of-wedlock child. And it's a long story to tell you how I eventually found who his mother was. Another example of a non-existent couple. And this was something that took, probably 35 years to solve. John F. Shea died in Fall River, Mass. In 1925. And I knew his children very well. And John Shea's death certificate states that his parents were Dennis Shea and Eva Bard. And right up until his daughter's death, I said to her, There is no such couple as Dennis Shea and Eva Bard. The names just don't belong together. And actually, the obituary was more correct than the death record. So who knows why the doctor filling out the death record came up with this name, Eva Bard. And so from John Shea's obituary, it gives his birthplace in Ireland, and from his baptism, it tells us that his parents were Dennis and Ellen Donegan Shea. So sometimes, but not always, an obituary can be more accurate than whoever supplied the information on a death certificate, particularly when it is someone outside the family. And another whole avenue that can lead to great confusion among researchers, particularly among people born in Ireland, is their age at death. We have the death here of an Abby Sullivan in Holbrook, Massachusetts, allegedly 76 years old at the time of her death. This would prove to be off by 12 or 13 years. In tracing her back in the census, we find her supposedly 55 years old in 1880, but she couldn't have been 55 because she had two husbands, and tracing her back in time through Irish records, she married as her second husband a man named Cornelius Sullivan, and her first husband was a man named John Mahoney, and she was actually born closer to 1818, so she was much closer to 88 or 89 years old at the time of her death, and not 76, as alleged on her death certificate. And looking at this parish abstract here, you notice that her name is given as Gobnet. And Gobnet is the Irish form, Gubnetta, is the Irish form of the name Abigail, and the nickname for Abigail sometimes was Gubby. And coming in part 2, which I will have lots of good examples from, we are going to have misremembered lore, which means that someone tells you a family story, it gets handed down, but it doesn't mean that it's correct or has a slight variation that can send you off in the wrong direction. And as we ascend in the obstruction of information, we have obfuscation. And obfuscation simply means that someone is supplying you with information that is knowingly wrong, or trying to cloud you from uncovering the correct information. We have half-truths, which means that some of the record might be correct, but most of it is not correct. And then there are people, and we're not even getting into the whole can of worms that DNA can open, but we have people who outright lied on their records. And this sometimes covers a bigamous marriage or disputed paternity. And lastly, I have to share with you the most outrageous instance of someone that had a completely fabricated life story of her life for the last 40 years. She lived way into her 80s, went back and forth between here and Shanghai, China. And her obfuscation led to the FBI having a 200-page file on her, which I was able to access through the Freedom of Information Act. But you'll have to wait for all of that in part 2.